Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator of the Gun Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for Frederick Gunn, an American Original. This evening, our distinguished guests, Peter Becker, Emily Gum, and Bart McMahon, will share the amazing story of Washington resident Frederick Gunn. Jean Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing them. During this lecture, we please ask that you mute both your audio and video settings. If you have questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box, and Peter, Emily, and Bart will answer some of them at the end. Please note that the 14th annual Washington Cemetery Tour is taking place on October 29th this year. And our next guest lecturer is William Hoseley, who will present Reflections on the Marble Corridor of Western New England on Monday, November 15th at 6:30. Please mark your calendars and register for these events on the Gun Museum's website. Now I'd like to hand it over to Jean.
Hello and good evening. My name is Jean Solomon. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturers, Peter Becker, Emily Gum, and Bart McMahon. Peter Becker became the Frederick Gunn School 11th head in 2012. He earned a bachelor's degree in religious studies from the University of Virginia and a master's degree in history from Yale University. Over 8 years, he served as a Master of History and Interdisciplinary Studies, housemaster, department chair, and coach at the Lawrenceville School. Prior to that, he was on the national staff of the Fellowship of Christians in Universities and Schools and had a career as an investment banking and venture capital analyst. Emily Gum is the assistant head of school for teaching and learning at the Frederick Gunn School. She received an undergraduate degree in international relations and theological studies from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and a Master of Philosophy in Theology and Religion from the University of Oxford. She is currently working toward a Doctor of Philosophy in Ethics from the University of Oxford. Bart McMahon is the director of the Center for Citizenship and Just Democracy, a member of the History Department faculty and former History Department chair at the Frederick Gunn School. He holds a bachelor's degree in government and legal studies from Bowdoin College and a master's degree in social sciences from Wesleyan University. He is also a Connecticut State Coordinator for Braver Angels, an organization that seeks to depolarize America. Thank you, Peter, Emily, and Bart, for your participation here this evening. And now I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you, Jean. And I want to thank you and Stephen and everyone at the Gun Museum for this opportunity to talk about Frederick Gunn, one of our favorite topics in the world. And I also want to thank everyone else who's joined on the Zoom. It is really fun to see so many familiar names from really around the country, as well as here in town, coming into the Zoom. So thanks for joining us. As Jean just said, I'm joined by my colleagues, Emily Gum, our assistant head for teaching and learning, a philosopher by training who also leads our Gunn Scholar program, and Bart McMahon, former chair of our history department and founding director of our Center for Citizenship and Just Democracy, which is a program really that exists to equip our current students with Frederick Gunn's vision and practice of what it means to be an active citizen. We are thrilled to be here for a lot of reasons, including that the Frederick Gunn School and Gunn Memorial Library and Museum are both the fruit of the same people. So Emily, if you'll go to the first slide. Frederick and Abigail Gunn had a vision for and commitment to education, training the heart as well as the head, and to their hometown of Washington, and really the intersection of these commitments. The school, the library, and the museum have long enjoyed a mutually fruitful relationship, and I'm so excited about the fabulous exhibit about Washington that Stephen and the museum have created. If you haven't been here to see it yet, please get in there, as well as just the renewed interest in Frederick Gunn that we're seeing as a school. And who knows, perhaps one day the Library and Museum will also decide to change their name so that people will stop coming to Washington on the mistaken assumption that our town has one of the country's leading libraries and museums dedicated to firearms. But that is way beyond my purview. That was a joke. Zoom is a tough format for jokes, but hang with me. We want to acknowledge at the outset two people who are largely to thank for keeping and preserving the material artifacts about Mr. Gunn. Adam Korpalski is a Washingtonian who I hope some of you know. He compiled primary sources from the school's founding through 1975 in this book, which is on the next slide. And it is a terrific source of selected correspondence between Frederick Gunn and peers, parents, students, and alumni. One of the failures of my time as head is that I have not reached out to Mr. Kopalski, but I owe him dinner. I owe you dinner, Adam, if you're on the Zoom. I spent a lot of time in his book, and we are really grateful for it. The other person to acknowledge at the outset is our beloved Paula Gibson Krimsky. If you go to the next slide, Paula, as many of you know, passed away a year ago. Our archives here at school are named after her and her husband, George, who himself was a graduate of the gunnery class of 1960, because Paula dedicated much of the last 25 years of her life to finding, cataloging, transcribing, and really preserving Mr. Gunn's letters, writings, and photographs from the earliest days of the school and his time as a young adult in Washington. A wonderful group of volunteers helped her to do all of that, as she was always quick to point out, and we are grateful to them too. We still miss Paula every day, and we dedicate this talk to her. We've divided the presentation into three parts and are really cognizant that there is so much that we had to leave on the cutting room floor in the interest of time. We will focus on what the primary sources tell us about Frederick Gunn as an abolitionist, as an educator, and as a citizen. Among the many things that we leave out is much discussion of Abigail or of Mr. Gunn's rich spiritual life, and so many stories that illustrate the kind of person he was outside of the three areas of focus for this evening. One goal that we have for everyone is that you leave with the desire to learn more. And if we succeed in that, I recommend that everyone read Mr. Gunn's biography, The Master of the Gunnery. We have an image of it or one version of it in the next slide. It is the best single volume source about Mr. Gunn. It was compiled by his earliest alumni, including local Washingtonian and former student and friend of Mr. Gunn's, Senator Orville Platt, who you'll hear from a couple of times tonight, who, like Mr. Gunn, was an abolitionist and a leader of Washington's Underground Railroad, as well as being a revered senator for a long stretch of the end of the 19th century. Originals of the book still show up at the Green Fair every now and then, and we're hoping to produce an affordable reprint. In the meantime, we have a high quality PDF that is available, and I'll share it with Stephen. If you'd like it, perhaps you can send it out at a one-off basis. But it is a wonderful description also of life in Washington in the 19th century, filled with illustrations by the great naturalist and illustrator William Hamilton Gibson, also a former student. And really, The Master of the Gunnery is the first reason I fell in love with the school and its founder, and why I pursued this job in the first place. But that is a story for another time. So first, to the topic that I'll take, abolition and the Underground Railroad. I want to briefly situate Mr. Gunn in space and time. So the next slide is a timeline of a chunk of his life, of his early life. He was born in Washington to John Gunn and Polly Ford in 1816. He was the youngest of 8 kids. And it's significant and a little eerie right now that his parents died of a plague within months of each other when Mr. Gunn was 10 years old. He was raised by his older siblings, principally by his brother John, and by educators. He left for Yale in 1833 and returned to Washington in 1837, age 21, pretty determined to become a medical doctor. He started teaching to pay the bills in the meantime, and it turned out he was a very effective teacher, as Emily will explore in a bit. But it also turned out that he fainted at the sight of blood. So a career as a doctor in the first half of the 19th century was pretty much off the table. As we turn to Mr. Gunn, the abolitionist, it is really vital, and this is something that I'm particularly passionate about, that as we sit in the 21st century today, we not commit the error of presentism. Namely, that we not try to fit Mr. Gunn into present day categories. He defies the typical sort of liberal, progressive versus conservative divide today in ways that I think are really instructive. He was very much independently minded, as we'll see, and held views that in some cases would today be considered progressive and others that would be considered conservative or traditional. His thought and action, though, had great integrity, and you really need to step into his heart and his mind and his time to be able to understand that, which is one of the things that I believe, as a former history teacher, makes the disciplined study of history so fun and so important. Maybe the most important thing to understand is that Mr. Gunn, in terms of his abolitionism, was not always on the right side of history on the topic of slavery. While the abolitionist cause seems obviously the correct one today, if you go to the next slide, Emily, many of Washington's most prominent citizens and leaders, including the leadership of the Congregational Church here on the Green, saw abolitionists as troublemakers and believed that the Southern states should be left free from intervention into their economy and their way of life. When Mr. Gunn returned from Yale in 1837, he largely agreed with this position, which is a remarkable thing to reflect on today. His stance put him at odds with his older brother, John, who is considered one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement in Washington and in the surrounding towns, according to the Master of the Gunnery. And this brings us to our first use of the Master of the Gunnery as a primary source. This is a chapter, each chapter is written by a different alumnus. This chapter was written by Orville Platt himself, and it recounts the following. He says about Mr. Gunn, it was just at this point, the late 30s, early 40s, when politics, the church, and the community were all aflame with hatred of abolitionism, that Frederick Gunn began his career as a teacher in Washington. And he says, no one unacquainted with the storm and stress period of Mr. Gunn's life, when he was fighting an apparently hopeless battle against all that was most powerful in the church, society, and politics, that is to say, after he had committed his life to abolitionism, no one can understand the profound influence of that conflict in the formation of his character. It was then that he learned to trust no political party with the control of his political principles and no church with the control of his conscience. Platt goes on to say, Frederick had taken little interest, and this is key. You can go to the next slide, please, Emily. Frederick had taken little interest in this contest between the abolitionists and the anti-abolitionists until about the time of his return from New Preston. We'll get into that in a bit. But in such a struggle, it was impossible for him to be neutral when once his attention was directed to the issue. He began to argue with his brother John, whose mind, gathering fire and acuteness from his convictions, was more than a match for the cooler logic of younger brother Frederick. Then Mr. Gunn began to read abolition books and papers for the purpose of refuting the arguments contained in them, that he might be able to convince his brother that the crusade against slavery was wrong. The result is easily foreseen, it goes on to say. He himself was convinced, and with the lofty courage of his innate manliness, became a leader on the anti-slavery side. So point number one, Mr. Gunn changed his mind. Always a courageous thing to do, especially when it means that you have to tell your older brother that he was right and you were wrong. We believe this conversion happened around 1840 because Mr. Gunn first teaches in the Academy building on the Green, now part of the property called the Abbey at 16 Kirby Road. And he first does that in the fall of 1839. And he did not hold the abolitionist convictions that would result in being expelled from that building by the school's trustees a few years later. His abolitionist advocacy really picks up steam through the 1840s and eventually costs him his place in Washington for a time. One really remarkable event in this time fueled his commitment to the cause. Two of his sisters had married and moved to Goldsboro, North Carolina. So in 1843, Mr. Gunn travels to North Carolina to see and study slavery firsthand. It's from this trip that we have a few of his letters, including one with an excerpt on the next slide, in which he conveys that his brother-in-law, Dr. Andrews, tells him that under no circumstances may Mr. Gunn advocate for abolitionism locally in North Carolina. Mr. Gunn writes to his father-in-law, Daniel Brinsmead. He says this, part of which is excerpted here on the slide. He writes, I had hoped that my connection with Dr. Andrews, who has great influence and popularity here and extensive acquaintance among the higher classes, might introduce me to some slaveholders with whom I could converse freely upon their abominable system. But I have given up hope. The South is worse than I ever thought it. I've had a long confidential talk with Dr. A upon the subject. I told him I meant to talk with the gentlemen slaveholders to whom he introduced me, and was willing for myself to risk the consequences of a stump speech to the people. At all events, to the candid men, I must talk in private at least. Dr. Andrews replied, upon this subject, there are no candid men. And he entreated that if not for myself, yet for the sake of him and his family, I would hold my peace. He could protect me from personal violence, but it would be at the sacrifice of all his prospects in life, of his standing in society, and all the interests of his family. He dare not let it be known that I am an abolitionist, nor allow me to speak to his most intimate friends. He felt that I would not refrain in consequence of any fears for myself, and therefore he urged me solely out of regard for himself and my sisters. The doctor wishes me to stay that I may study slavery, but I find in order to do it, I must become a slave. Besides, what chance have I to study when I can neither converse with the tyrants nor their victims? I shall not stay here long on such terms. I will not sacrifice my friends, but they must not expect me to sacrifice myself. So Mr. Gunn returns in 1843, age 27, even more committed to the abolitionist cause. And we have reason to believe that it is this period from the early 1840s until 1847, and then after his return to Washington in 1849, that Orville Platt is again referring to when he describes Mr. Gunn's role as one of the leaders of the Underground Railroad in Washington. To the next slide, please. Platt writes in The Master of the Gunnery, Washington was a station on the Underground Railroad, and the occasional discovery of a Negro at or near the house of some abolitionist was sufficient evidence that the fugitive slave law was deliberately violated by the concealing and assisting of escaping slaves. Many were the meetings held at Mr. Gunn's room and elsewhere, attended only by a few of the more daring abolitionists, in which plans were discussed and matured by which the fleeing bondman, that is slave, was shielded from pursuit and aided in his flight toward Canada and liberty. Goes on to say, Mr. Gunn never denied his violation of the fugitive slave law. He asserted his obligation to obey, quote, the higher law of a common brotherhood. He gloried in whatever obloquy attached to him for being true to humanity in disregarding an inhuman and barbarous enactment. We'll go to the next slide. This activity and his outspoken and very public denunciations of anti-abolitionists means that the trustees, as I referred to earlier, the trustees of the Academy on the Green no longer allow him to use that building, his original schoolroom. So he moves his teaching first to his sister's house and then to New Preston before finally leaving when he's invited to start a school in Towanda, Pennsylvania, and then returns to Washington in 1849 to start with what would become the gunnery in the house given to him and Abigail by Abigail's father, Daniel Brinsmead. The other outcome of his very public and active commitment to the abolitionist cause is that Mr. Gunn became part of the broader regional network of abolitionists, and therefore his school eventually became a place where other high-profile members of the cause sent their children. Among them, both Henry Ward Beecher and his more famous sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who, as you probably know, are originally from Litchfield. Thanks to Adam Korpalski, we have a number of exchanges between Harriet Beecher Stowe and Mr. Gunn about her son, Charlie, as well as letters Charlie wrote home about his time at school. In the interest of time, I will just give you a taste of their dialogue, which really focused naturally on Charlie more than it did on abolitionism per se. Just last week, as we welcomed students to campus for the start of our 172nd year, I read the following letter to our new parents from Harriet Beecher Stowe to Mr. Gunn, just to demonstrate that while many things have changed since 1862 when Charlie started here, boarding school parents have not changed that much. We can go to the next slide. Mrs. Stowe writes, "Dear Mr. Gunn, I suppose that all the 24 fathers and mothers that have boys in your little conservatory may be as unreasonable as I am. I want a line from you or Mrs. Gunn to know how Charlie is coming or how he seems and appears. It seems unreasonable to ask it, but as I did not see either of you when I came with him, we don't know why, I have always had a sort of unfulfilled feeling, much as if I had left him at the gates of a hospital. His letters being conceived in the laconic style peculiar to boys' first efforts do not much enlighten me, and sometimes I wish somebody would write me a note about him and say if he is good or naughty and how he gets on. Please accept my best wishes for a happy new year. I am your friend, Harriet Beecher Stowe." It's worth noting that Charlie's time at the school coincided with the height of his mother's fame, including her famous meeting with Abraham Lincoln at the White House on November 25th, 1862, and that Charlie Stowe seems to have been one of the students who accompanied Mr. Gunn on one of his first camping trips, which they referred to as gypsying, a topic that Emily will touch on in her remarks. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in an undated letter, presumably prior to the fall term of 1862, but we don't really know. "Dear Mr. Gunn, I thank you for your kind letter." And I think maybe we have this on a slide, Emily. "I thank you for your kind letter. Charlie was fervent to go to that gypsying party. In fact, ever since I told him about it, he has left me no peace, only to intercede with his father to let him go. Mr. Stowe has at last consented, particularly when the fall term begins." So I will stop there. As is true with any good history, there is so much more to share about Mr. Gunn, certainly as an abolitionist, leader of the Underground Railroad, but I will turn it over to my colleague, Emily Gum, to discuss Mr. Gunn's educational philosophy. Emily.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. It is wonderful to be here with you this evening. I am Emily Gum. I'm the Assistant Head of School for Teaching and Learning. So I spend a lot of time thinking about Frederick Gunn's educational philosophy, talking about it with students, talking about it with our fellow teachers here. And what's incredible about Frederick Gunn is that he wasn't just about a generation ahead of his time in relation to progressive educational philosophy, but he, so much of what he said and taught and lived for as an educator is absolutely relevant to what we do today. And so we do spend a lot of time as a school reading what he said, thinking about the way that he interacted with students. And that's pretty rare. It's pretty rare to have a school founded in 1850 and to be able to look up to our founder and to our founders, because the more I learn about Abigail Brinsmaid Gunn, the more impressed I am by her as well. And so it's a heavy mantle. It's an incredible opportunity to work at a school founded by such forethought and such integrity in their work as educators. So when I think of Frederick Gunn, I think of him as a social entrepreneur first, and I think of his medium, so to speak, as a school first and foremost. So he did many things, and Bart McMahon's going to tell us about some of the other activities that he was involved in here socially, but the school was his life. There's this anecdote that he and Abigail actually lived in like the alcove of a hallway in the school building, which feels incredible. I mean, we feel as boarding school faculty like we're right in the middle of things. That's a whole nother level of right in the middle of things. But the school really was his life. So he was a social entrepreneur. The school was his life. And he really was a good 20 to 50 years ahead of other educators in these few points about his educational philosophy that I want to point out to us. So let me situate that, just hit the high points on the dates one more time so that you can just see the school piece of what he was doing. And then I'll just talk through a couple of the points of his educational philosophy. So 1826, the year he lost his parents, I do think is a really important moment because at that point, both that we learn about his mother's strong desire that he become a minister, which is in the background of him and his story, and that he is really placed into the hands of his siblings and the educators who helped to educate and form him. And then 10 years after that, he's graduating from Yale in 1837. And as Peter said, thinks he wants to be a doctor, really doesn't know. There are some great anecdotes about what he was like as a student at Yale, where he's clearly very intelligent and smart. He's an amazing athlete, but there aren't athletics at Yale during this time. And he just wants to do good in the world. And so he comes back, he becomes a teacher because he sort of needs something to do. And then you can sort of see in his story how becoming an educator takes root in his heart and defines really who he is for the rest of his life. And so by 1850, he's founded the school that we now call the Frederick Gunn School with Abby, with the help of her parents, purchasing the building, which was on the location that now our Gunn dormitory sits on our main quad on campus. So still very much in the center of how we imagine life together here was their original building there with us. This is a photograph of that, an early photograph of the Gunnery Schoolhouse in the 1870s. To give you a little taste of what life was like for them. So two sort of high points about his educational philosophy. The first is the fact that this school has believed since Frederick Gunn that strength of character is the goal of education, and really meant it under Frederick Gunn and continues to live by that, even at a time where talking about moral character is somewhat fraught publicly. But you can't get away from Frederick Gunn when you're the Frederick Gunn School, and we have good reason not to try to get too far away from him. He thought of school not as a place for the education of scholars, but as a place for the formation of civic actors. And so book learning had a role in this. There's this great anecdote out of the Master of the Gunnery that says he studied for the effect of study upon the mind and the heart. So book learning very much a part of what he's doing, and excellence in everything he does is a part of what he's doing. But seeing the integration, what we now call our ecosystem, our teaching and learning ecosystem, between the academic learning, sport, and then above all else, life together and the experiences of nature. I'm not going to say much about his educational philosophy, about his disciplinary philosophy, but it's very much part of what he's doing at the school, is using every part of their life together as a way to help form these students. And you can see here from Harriet Beecher Stowe, again, just this idea that the moral atmosphere that's around these students is very much what Fred and Abby are all about. And it animates really what Frederick Gunn believes the life of a teacher is, which is a powerful idea. One of the examples of the way this plays out were these trips that Frederick Gunn led with his students. So this is an image of a camp that he set up with his students down at Lake Warramug, which is just down the road. And this builds out of a tradition of 2 or 3 trips down to the coast in Milford. where Frederick Gunn has his students really exploring and understanding that experience is education for these students. And so he has these early pilgrimages, so to speak, he calls them gypsying, where he's really helping the boys to learn about the sacrifices of service to their country. He's helping the boys think about feeding and caring for themselves, and he's having them explore and experience nature. What's interesting about this is these are the scenes that allow Frederick Gunn to be credited with the founding of recreational camping in the United States. But what Frederick Gunn was doing, while he was absolutely doing recreational camping, was establishing kids in nature and in the natural environment to explore and learn, because experiential learning was the core of what he was doing. So he had this instinct for the moral and civic life, experiential education, and this instinct to connect one-on-one with students through what we would now call psychological safety or trust. That really was the core of how he thought about education. So here is this wonderful anecdote about the way that nature and the natural world helps to educate. This is out of The Master of the Gunnery. There is a subtle yet powerful influence exerted in the formation of character by the scenes of natural beauty amid which one spends his boyhood. The woods, hills, fields, sky, air, and water, the birds and flowers, all seem to become part of the boyish life and to develop and strengthen all manly traits and qualities. So just a wonderful anecdote about the way that the natural world interwove just seamlessly into how he taught and lived with his students. I'm going to leave us with this longer quote that I'll read to us in a second. It comes from this talk that Frederick Gunn gave called Confidence Between Boys and Their Teachers in 1870. And this talk is one of the longest, most sustained places that we have to see what Frederick Gunn had in mind when he was thinking about a school, and what advice he had to teachers. And a lot of this is this idea of confidence. Again, when we talk about it internally now, we think about it as a very early sort of remarkable intuition that he had around what the neuroscience and research is showing so powerfully today, which is one of the reasons that we're excited to be sort of exploring and thinking about his thought. But when we think as educators, what is it that our kids are coming to us with and what do they need from us? We know increasingly as educators that they need a sense of confidence in their own learning, and they need over time to build that muscle of confidence, and they need trust with their teachers to be able to make those connections that are going to drive their learning forward. So in that sense, a very individualized approach to learning, a very student-centered approach to learning, and ultimately an approach that leads not just to learning and excellence in high school and college, but a life of learning, which is the school motto, a good person is always learning, and one that we repeat often and truly believe. So let me read this because it's a wonderful moment in this Confidence Between Boys and Their Teachers. And then I'm going to hand it back over to Bart so that you can see how this civic instinct that lends itself to the creation of the school and his teaching plays itself out more broadly in public. So this is Frederick Gunn. I have in mind a school composed about equally of boys and girls. The school is situated in the country, or if in the city, the generous city fathers have afforded it liberal space with trees and flowers. The teachers are large-hearted and loving, and absolutely free from dyspepsia or any morbid tendency. The boys are from all classes in society and of all degrees of goodness, and also many degrees of badness, just as they have always been. The atmosphere is warm and genial. Love and confidence shine in every face. There is fun and frolic in every eye you catch. that, I'll hand it over. It's a wonderful vision.
Thanks, Emily. This evening, I'm going to talk about Gunn as a citizen. And it's first off very important to note that the school was founded on the town green, a communal space. And it was there that Gunn became an integral member of the town. Next slide, please. A true American original, Frederick Gunn was the confluence of a number of democratic reform movements from the 1800s. As described earlier by Mr. Becker, Gunn was an ardent abolitionist, but he was also influenced by the educational reform movement, transcendentalism, and the temperance movement. In fact, the master of the gunnery tells this tale recalling Gunn's exuberance in ridding the town of alcohol. And I quote, "Gunn's aggressiveness in the matter of total abstinence may be judged by a single example. During the building of the railroad, a man opened in Washington a low groggery for the sale of drinks to the workmen grading the line. He drove a profitable trade until he was found out. A party of substantial citizens, led by Mr. Gunn, instantly visited the hut where the liquors were sold, raised it to the turf, and poured every drop of liquor on the ground. To the threat of prosecution for damages, Gunn promptly replied, 'I take all the responsibility, sir.' An alliance to one of the most respected families in the community, the Brinsmaids, was a great advantage to Mr. Gunn's standing as a citizen in Judea. But his character was a deeper cause to his success. Where before he had been outspoken and aggressive, his marriage to Abigail and his founding of the school, along with his appreciation for tact and conciliation, won him many more friends in town. His instinctive understanding of human nature, blended with natural qualities of leadership, gave him an influence that grew each and every year. While Gunn was not a regular attendant at town meetings, he oftentimes was called on as an advisor to resolve disputes in town, and he did so with humor, humility, and a passion for the truth. I quote now again from the master of the gunnery. Gunn felt the same interest in the improvement of the townspeople as he did in his pupils, though the needs of the two were, in general, very different. The delicately nurtured boy from the city was made to join active sports and lead a hardy outdoor life to teach him manliness, fortitude, and self-reliance. The native of Washington was less in need for such training. Like Mr. Gunn himself, they had all more and less experience of the rock-ribbed soil and wintry blasts. They required most the warm sunshine of genial humanizing intercourse, social amenities, the refining influence of books, lectures, dramatic entertainments. And it was to these objects that the efforts of Mr. Gunn was chiefly directed. Next slide, please. Mr. Gunn believed that the greatest need of a rural community was a freer commingling of its members, a relaxation of the grim, half-isolated existence that had characterized Puritan New England. Soon after the founding of the school, Gunn was an active and vital participant in creating a village library and was elected its first president. As president, Gunn began a debating society named the Judea Lyceum. He presided at early meetings, introduced questions of political and social import as subjects of debate, and especially encouraged the discussion of topics of the day. He taught members to closely observe parliamentary rules and gave them elocutionary drill and instruction, all of which he was abundantly qualified to do. Under his direction, the society became far more than an average debate society. Senator Orville Platt gratefully recalled the discipline he gained in those debates on the rustic floor of Judea Lyceum as integral to his success as a US Senator. Next slide, please. The Dramatic Association was an important outgrowth of the school exhibitions. As the school grew in favor, parents and relatives of scholars from surrounding towns attended the performance of plays. Older people took part in the cast, and this naturally led to the organization of Society for Theatricals. The Dramatic and Literary Association was formed in 1869 as renovations were completed to the Farmers Hall, which served as its home. This new civic venture would not have been possible without the school, nor Mr. Gunn's financial support and investments. Gunn chose to perform the plays Uncle Tom's Cabin and Neighbor Jackwood for drama exhibitions. He saw in them a means of bringing vividly before his local audience the evils of slavery and extinguishing the last remnant of pro-slavery sentiment that lingered in the community. The financial success of the drama and entertainment exhibitions encouraged Mr. Gunn to plan for a town course of lectures by noted men and women. A committee was authorized to make engagements with some of the most distinguished lecturers in the country. Yet so quietly and unobtrusively was his work done that few were ever aware of the important part Gunn played in bringing a large number of famous men and women to lecture in Washington. Next slide, please. Mr. Gunn's attitude regarding the outdoors and the importance of physical development made it possible and acceptable for men in town to play baseball on the green. While most residents of Judea in those days were of straight-laced and long-faced Puritans, Mr. Gunn enjoyed life. Senator Orville Platt once remarked, "Mr. Gunn was full of youthful spirits. He loved fun, he enjoyed a practical joke, he liked to display his strength, and he occasionally engaged in harmless schemes planned and executed expressly to shock the severe and staid proprieties of the Puritan village." As a true American original, Frederick Gunn was a revolutionary leader in the development of small town baseball. With the support of the townspeople who lived on the green and former students, Gunn hosted the quote unquote great game in August of 1869, which is depicted in this photo. A new generation of baseball in the United States developed right in Washington on the green. How? The reason is this. Judge William H. Cott, first president of the National Association of Baseball Players, sent his 3 sons to the gunnery. Because of this decision, Washington, and by association nearby towns such as Litchfield and New Milford, were present at the emergence of a new and improved American game. Until then, only men in cities played using the new baseball rules with overhand throws and diamond-shaped playing pitch. One could say that Frederick Gunn had an integral role in baseball becoming America's favorite pastime by the turn of the 20th century. Now, I will hand it back to Peter Becker for our conclusion.
Thanks, Bart. And Emily, if you wouldn't mind keeping that photograph up, if people aren't familiar with it yet, I don't know if it's easy to go back. If not, don't worry about it. Let me say this in the interest of time. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. I'm going to say a couple things and then bring us to a close. We hope that you see from what is for us a really brief dive into these 3 distinct elements of Frederick Gunn, why we believe he deserves recognition both as an American original, but also far beyond the recognition he's garnered thus far in American history. The founder of American Camping, key figure in the first known photograph of a baseball game, which is on the screen in front of us, although it's recently been unseated. An abolitionist and leader of the Underground Railroad, and a wise, creative, student-centered educational pioneer. We believe he deserves recognition really among the great figures of the American 19th century. His eulogies, as I said, the Master of the Gunnery is just so full of information about Mr. Gunn and about Washington, and different alumni in their chapters essentially include a eulogy at the very end. They also include at the very end of the second to last chapter, the full length, I believe, of Henry Ward Beecher's eulogy. Beecher came up at the end of a year after Mr. Gunn died. and left us with this. You can go to the quotation, Emily. He has not gone from us. He never was so near us. He never was so influential as he is today among us. He dwells in the very history of this town. He lives on these hills. His institution is purified, not alone by what overhangs the scene of his life, but there lingers there a benediction emanating from what is missed in the absence of the old master, as of the angels of God, and his memory is more serviceable to this community than his presence now would be. He will still be a blessing that will guide the coming generation in this goodly town of Washington. May the spirit of this man who has quickened the lives of so many never go out. May it abide here. And so I'll say this, Emily, if you can go to I think the final slide. Thank you. It was the one I was just reading. So I'll just say this by way of closing. May the spirit of Frederick and Abigail Gunn abide here in this town indeed, and around the country emanating from here. And with that, I just want to say a quick thank you. And I think and hope we have time for questions that Jean and Stephen will moderate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter and Emily and Bart. This has just been fantastic. It's just been so enriching and informative. But Peter, you mentioned that you left a lot on the cutting room floor. Can you give us a sense of what about Frederick Gunn you didn't discuss tonight?
Thank you so much. And I am keeping an eye on the time. Emily mentioned Abigail, and I don't think it's really fair to talk about Frederick Gunn without talking about Abigail. So here's one piece that I literally left on the cutting room floor about 3 minutes ago. Henry Ward Beecher, at the end of what he just said, may it abide here, he then went on to say, let me also say, and Abigail's still alive, she's present for this, so you just imagine this moment, surrounded by alumni of the school, up here on the green. God's grace and blessing be upon the head of her that stood by his side and was mother as he was mother and master as he was master, and filled out every nook and corner of the great life in that school, making him largely what he was, or sustaining him in the great conflicts that he was obliged to go through. I think that gives you a sense of the appreciation that people had for Abigail. Emily just shared with our students a story of her making pancakes because she was the cook for the school, and drilling a student in Latin at the same time. So Abigail never gets enough credit. That would be one that comes to mind for me. And maybe I'll invite Bart and Emily if you have a favorite story or an element that we didn't touch on tonight, that you would pull up.
I had mentioned his discipline philosophy with the students, which is really interesting. So one of the things that he did was there was a school meeting, a family meeting that the school had, where if a student got in trouble, he was actually quite strict. He was very fun and full of life, but quite strict. They would all sit down and meet together to discuss what the sort of response to the student was going to be. And so again, you just see these anecdotes of being at least a generation ahead of his time as an educator, and thinking about, I mean, really that idea doesn't get prominence until Lawrence Kohlberg in the middle of the 20th century, of what it means to think about building a democracy through life together in a school. But there's quite a bit more from his educational philosophy that just has resonance, and frankly, that we haven't even fully lived into as educators in the 21st century.
Thank you. Question from Terry Wilson. Terry is interested to know more. Well, you've spoken about his wife, but did he have children, any descendants carrying on his philosophy now? I don't know if you're familiar with that, or if you have information.
So I'll speak quickly just to say they did have children, and one of his descendants is actually, I noticed in the participant, is on this call or on this meeting by a different last name, not because he's hiding himself, but names change over the course of 150 years. So his descendants are very much alive, and many of them, in my experience, are carrying on his philosophy. More about his children can be found in The Master of the Gunnery. They have I think a pretty complete accounting in there.
So a question from Robert Sladen. Robert asks, were Frederick and Abigail Gunn Quakers? I do know that the Quakers were abolitionists, but that's his question.
Art, do you want to take that?
Sure. So he was not a Quaker, though. When he went to Towanda, Pennsylvania, he met many Quakers and was familiar with Quakerism. He was a non-denominational. One thing I was going to bring up about what we didn't mention was how important his faith was. He was Christian, and Jesus Christ was his savior. And he speaks often in his letters about his personal relationship to Jesus Christ. But he was not a fan of organized religion at all, and was more of the transcendentalists. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a real, did not like the Congregationalist Church. At the same time, didn't belong to at the time, if you weren't part of the Congregationalist Church in this area, you were most likely an Episcopalian, but he never became Episcopalian, and really read the Bible with Abigail, and they both did not go to organized faith.
Thank you. We have questions from Ashley Fernandez and also Dimitri, and they speak about, or the questions are about how he and Abigail viewed co-education, and then in the quote of Gunn's lecture, it is mentioned that boys and girls should be educated equally. In the early years of the school, were girls also educated? Did Abigail play a part in this, if it's true?
Sorry, I froze at the very end of that, so I'm going to hand it to Emily.
We actually all froze. So I'm going to assume that we're talking about coeducation and what we know and don't know. And I will say, one of the fun things about my job is I get to work with our students on our Gunn Scholar program, which is our archival research original scholarship program for students. And there's a lot that we don't know. And coeducation is one of those areas where we have these anecdotes about the education between girls and boys in the classroom. We have some early photographs. We've got possibly some early sort of sense that there were different parts of the dorm sort of building that were designated for girls. But it's actually a live area of research that we're doing right now to fully understand when Frederick started educating girls alongside boys. We think it was in that first school on the Green, and also whether he educated students of color, especially in Towanda, which is not in any of the quotes that we read here, but he was really, again, just ahead of his time. I mean, he really believed that to learn, one needed to be in a, for that time, diverse population to truly know what it means to be human and learn well what it means to live as a civic agent in the world. So more research coming. You can have us back.
Thank you. A question has come in from Christine Adams, and the question is involving New Preston. And she asks which building in New Preston the Gunn School occupied, if you're familiar with that.
And thank you. And it looks like Christine also asked about some of the which building sort of around here on the Green. So I don't actually know the answer to the New Preston question, and I don't know if Bart or Emily do, or maybe Stephen does. But I don't think it's identified in the Master of the Gunnery. Here in the Green area, it started on the Green in a building that was moved from the Green that's now part of the house at 16 Kirby Road, that's called the Abbey. not for anything having to do with religion, but because after Mr. Gunn died, it is the building that's the house where Abigail lived. So that was called Washington Academy, and it was the first place. It was a place where almost like serial educators would come and set up shop for a year or two. That is the place where he was kicked out of by the trustees when he became too ardent of an abolitionist. And then when he came back, he was given, he and Abigail were given the house that I believed had belonged to Abigail's sister, but I could be wrong about that. That was on what's now 47, where Gunn dorm here is on campus that Emily had shown earlier earlier in her piece.
Okay. There is a question here about how many slaves were helped to freedom through the Underground Railroad in Washington. I don't know. That's a question that you have the answer to.
No, I will add, Emily mentioned that specific to the school, the history of sort of co-education and getting more details is something that we're interested in. Speaking for myself, I think for the museum and for many people who have asked me and others about it, we really, I think, have a local responsibility and interest to really research and unpack the history of the Underground Railroad. Stephen put in the chat the building, the home of Senator Platt, which I think is known as sort of the primary stop on the Underground Railroad. Some of the other families, because certainly it was not the Gunns alone, they were very much a part of a network. But as far as I know, we do not know, we don't have any evidence of numbers. And when I taught American history, something that you start to think about is the absence of information. So they were breaking the law. They were breaking the fugitive slave law. And in a part of the excerpt that I left out from Senator Platt's description of Mr. Gunn's participation, he describes the intensity of the division in town over this issue. And I will, since we have a second, I will read this because I think it's really interesting history of the town. He says, if I may, he says this. This is Platt speaking. As incredible as it now seems, such conduct was really considered criminal, that is to say, the Underground Railroad, as criminal and sinful as any infraction of the moral law. And then a system of espionage was organized in the town by those who accepted the anti-abolitionist preaching for the purpose of ascertaining whether Mr. Gunn and others were in fact concealing and aiding fugitive slaves, of finding out to whom they belonged, and of furnishing information to the masters of the slaves, which should result in their capture and the criminal prosecution of those who had harbored them. It is believed that such espionage in several instances resulted in putting the agents of slaveholders on the track of the fugitives, but no captures were made, and so great was the care exercised by the abolitionists that sufficient evidence for their prosecution was never obtained. When the pursuit became too warm, the fugitive was driven in the night to the next station in Torringford, and the men hunters were compelled to abandon the chase. So you can envision just this very intense, it's an even smaller town than today. And whatever our intertown squabbles are, they haven't gotten to the point, as far as I know, of setting up systems of espionage to catch each other out and prosecute each other.
Remarkable. Lastly, I think that I'm just looking, actually somebody has asked, is Emily a direct relation to Frederick and Abigail?
My maiden name is Rowdenbush. I am Emily Rowdenbush, not at all related to the Anglophile New England. I'm a proud Pennsylvania Dutch.
Okay, all right. Well, Thank you so much. We're going to end right here. And I want to thank our audience so much for attending this evening. And we certainly hope that you've enjoyed this lecture. It's just been extraordinary. It's been brilliant in so many respects. And we're very grateful. So thank you again, Peter, Emily, and Bart, for your participation, and wish you all a good night.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay.